Greetings chess fans, my name is Arturs Neiksans, I'm the leading Latvian chess grandmaster, and with this video I'm continuing my video series about my own best games that I have played in my own career. My highest rating was 2637 and thus I have played a couple of nice, memorable and attacking games. This game is one of them. I played it in 2011, right after I got my third GM norm in European Team Chess Championships, and this was also the moment when I was transitioning from being a pure positional player to a more attacking player, because at some point I realized I have to play sharper chess, and this was also the moment when I was not really feeling those moments perfectly. Is this the right moment to sacrifice material or not? And I believe this game was one of those games that opened my eyes. My opponent was Vladimir Kirpichnikov, who is a well-known local national master. I think he's the national master, might be a FIDE Master, of rating 2300, 2400, and it was a rapid game. But still, it was a very entertaining one. So I opened up with e4. My opponent played g6, which, to be honest, cannot be a very good continuation because black immediately gives away the center. So I just immediately grab the center. I played d4, bishop g7, knight c3, and here my opponent played c6. And usually this move indicates that black wants to play d5, somehow echoing the ideas of the Caro-Kann, except that black has committed to perhaps not the best setup of g6 and bishop g7. And if my memory is not failing me, this setup was particularly popular back in the early 2000s or even the 90s, when many players would play like f4, d5, e5, followed by h5 and knight h6, also one of the pet weapons of one of the most known Latvian national masters, Jānis Daudzvardis. So instead here, I decided, okay, whatever, you can play d5 if you wanted, and I had anticipated to meet d5 with h3, because very often when black has the pawn on g6 and the pawn on c6, okay, maybe not even without the pawn on c6, black sometimes has problems with the bishop on c8. There's no g4, and sometimes f5 square also is not feeling that well, because the black bishop can never retreat to g6. But something else happened. After knight f3 here, my opponent played d6, which is something I didn't expect, and I suppose he wanted to play in the style of the Pirc variation, to play b5, b4, maybe play knight f6 and somehow challenge the center on e4. So according to the best tradition, I decided to play a4, which kind of makes sense. I'm grabbing space here, stopping b5, and here my opponent decided to play a5 to stop any further advancement. Now, I played h3, again, trying to play against the bishop on c8. As you can see, it has no squares on g4 and f5, and an e6 square, well, let's just put it this way, it feels weird. So my opponent decided to play queen c7, otherwise if he plays something like e5, I could just take it, take on d8, and he has weakened a lot of dark squares at the queen side, so queen c7 makes sense. Now I play bishop c4 and suddenly black starts to experience some problems. So the point is, he cannot quite play knight f6 because I'm gonna play e5, and now the inclusion of the move h3 stops black any knight g4 ideas. Meaning after captures, there's no knight g4, there's no knight e5. And now the point is, after knight e7, e6 is a common problem. I'm ruining his pawn structure, and also on top of the problems, knight g5 might be a big problem. Also, there's other problems, like after knight e7, a common trick is bishop takes an f7 shot, followed by knight g5, the king cannot go further, and here after knight e6, that's a classical fork, the queen, the bishop, the king is in trouble, so this position is just terrible, black. So I kind of knew the idea, but here my opponent decided to stop it. He played e5, so his idea is to play knight f6, short castle, and somehow try to survive the opening. But I developed a feeling I definitely have a lead in development. So, what you're supposed to do when you have a lead in development? Open up the position. So this is what I did. I decided to play d takes, and bishop e3. with a very simple idea. I want to play bishop c5, maybe threaten bishop d6 or slow him down from castling short and basically see what happens. My opponent decided to play knight e7 to stop it. And now as soon as he played knight e7, I'm thinking, wait a second. I know this idea with pawns on d6 and e7, as I showed you before. There is the shot, bishop takes on f7. I'm checking it. King f7, knight g5. Does this work? Because I want to play knight e6, the same fork idea, but he can play king e7, and I quite do not see the follow-up. So what do I do? Well, from my experience, I have learned is that sometimes when you spot an idea, you don't have to give up on it very early, because maybe it's going to work under better circumstances. And I also had a feeling I have to do something right away, because if I'm not going to play aggressive enough, for example, I'm going to play a castles, knight f6, and for example something like rook e1, it just feels I could have done more, and black has essentially escaped from the center and it has a pretty solid position. So how can I improve on my idea? I decided to play knight g5, which is a common idea from the two knights variation, hit a pawn on f7, and now black has to make the only move, knight h6. Now I checked, can I play bishop takes on f7? And guess what? It works. So I play bishop takes on f7 here, he has to accept it, I play knight e6 here, and even if this position might feel quite complex from the first eye, but to be honest, it's quite easy, because black has only one move, which is queen b8. And why is this? Because after queen e6, the point is I'm not going after the bishop on g7, I'm going after the rook. After knight c7 check here, king d8, knight takes on a8, white has an extra exchange and a pawn, even though it might feel that the knight on a8 might be trapped. But there's one nuance. The black pawn does not stand on a7, it stands on a5, and this means it's so much more difficult for black to carry out b6 and bishop b7. Now I know what you're thinking. What if black plays knight c4 followed by b6, bishop b7 and bishop a8 and yet somehow wins the knight on a8? Well, my experience tells that if black is unable to win the knight in the next couple of moves, usually you will have defensive resources, and I'm talking about most like bishop g5. Let's say black plays bishop f6, captures, let's say long castle, bishop d7, b3, and as you can see, black is not even close getting the knight, and actually as you can see now the knight is escaping from a8. So remember this trick, is that if your opponent cannot capture this piece immediately like in the next couple of moves, your defensive resources, they're definitely gonna increase. So that's why here my opponent decided to play queen b8. I accepted the bishop. King e7 is the only move, otherwise, I mean, I'm going back knight e6, knight c5, or knight g5 with my spoils of 4 exposed, king x pawn and everything, so king e7 is necessary. I had seen this position from the afar, and I had to calculate a single variation. Why is this? Because you develop sort of a gut feeling, white has an extra pawn, the opposing king is quite exposed. In the worst case scenario, white can always play knight f5, sacrifice a piece, maybe even knight h5 in some lines. The point is, now you sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns, but the king is wide open, we have enough pieces to go organize a direct attack. And also, the fact that we have obstacle bishops on the board, very often it means the opposing color bishop feels like an extra piece in the attack, and this position is wide open, the black king has nowhere to go. So I was not really stressed about this position, and I just felt I'm gonna figure it out. So I decided to start with queen g4, because maybe I'm gonna escape with the knight through the e6 square, but what I'm really doing, I'm attaching more pieces to the attack. For example, let's say he would have played king f6, try to win the knight immediately. I would just play knight f5, captured pawn on f5, and now you can see the king on f6 again is in the crossfire and threatening queen h4 check, knight e4 check, long castle, f4, whatever, rook e1, every single piece is joining the attack. And the fact that black has this extra piece, should it be the rook on a8 or the bishop on c8, I don't think it really matters when you have direct attack. So my opponent naturally knew it, and he played queen d6 instead, which makes sense. So he's gathering more defenders around the king, and he wants to use the queen to capture the knight on g7. So what should I do? I should not be thinking about how do I escape with the knight, but how do I gather more pieces to organize a direct assault against the black king. I played rook d1 here, hitting the queen. The only move which controls the e6 square is queen f6, and now I sacrifice the knight. Knight f5 check, takes and takes. As you can see, I have sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns, but now the king is wide open, knight e4 is incoming, and without again any heavy calculation, I just felt this should be over for black. So here my opponent played h5, which probably is the only move really. The point is, if he would play knight f8 and try to eliminate the pawn on f5, even though I cannot get support to the pawn on f5, by playing knight e7, black essentially waives any control of the c5 square. I would have played bishop c5 and knight e4. Now see, if black accepts the pawn, I'm capturing the queen and delivering a mate on the board. A lovely mating combination. So black cannot do that, and instead here he played h5, trying to get to the pawn on f5, so I had to play queen f3, still threatening knight e4, and here my opponent played knight e6, which, I don't know, I mean, engine says this is a mistake, but from a human perspective it kind of makes sense. Black wants to get to the pawn on f5, and it's quite difficult to see any other remedy against the threat of knight e4. Well, engine tries to convince me that knight g5 is playable, but to be honest, after queen g3, I just do not see the next move for black. The point is, after rook g8, black is self-pinning the rook on g8, and after h4, as you can see, the knight cannot retreat. So engine says knight f7, and black is somehow holding on. But again, even with the naked eye, you could easily see short castle, queen f5 and f4. Even now white has only 1 pawn for the sacrificed piece. Every single white piece is joining the attack. So black could try to close the position with something like h4 and e4. Bishop d4, easy move. Knight e4, we regain the pawn and the attack is going strong. This is just a killing attack. For example, black could play rook e6, we capture the pawn on h4 with a check, let's say king f8, knight g5 check, and this is just pure mathematics. The defense says they're not gonna hold, white's attack is way too strong. So this didn't happen in the game. My opponent played knight e6. So I played h4, but engine says there's something even better, which is the very exciting rook takes on d6. Quite fascinating. So the point is, after king d6, okay, this is pretty obvious, that's a fork, white wins immediately the game. But after queen takes on d6, engine just says, just complete development. Show castle. So white is down a full rook, this rook on a8, but the attack is killing. So let's say king e8, knight e4, queen f8, rook d1, million threats, knight e6, bishop g5, and white is killing. I don't think I saw this idea, but my excuse is I had another idea, which looks very human. So I played h4, and the idea is to play bishop g5, and the point is, black cannot really stop it. Yeah, let's say he will play rook g8, maybe I can play bishop g5, and h takes on g5, and now the rook on h1 joins the attack, and I already have the material advantage on the board, and the black king is wide open. So it's just completely over. So here, my opponent played king e8, and this is where the engine finds the move queen f5, which I had planned that I'm gonna play bishop g5. He cannot play king e6 because of the nice shot rook d6, king d6, and the queen on f5 is dropping, as you can see. But apparently here, after knight f6, bishop f6, again, king cannot take on f6 because the knight is hanging. I saw from afar I'm winning a pawn, and probably I'm very close to winning. And this is where the engine steps in and says, well, this is not the best you could have done in this position. So when you say it like that, I agree. But also, I've noticed in my competitive career that very often the players who are suffering from the black's perspective, they're not really inclined to choose such continuations because they might lose anyway this endgame. So that's why essentially there's a saying, if you're suffering with the music. So black plays king e8, he keeps the piece on the board and he casts some hopes. What if the defense holds? I play bishop g5 here, he cannot take on f5, the knight on d6 is dropping, he had to go here, now I complete development with the short castle. Now the point is, black cannot take on f5. So if he plays knight x on f5, I have a very simple move, knight e4. There's again million threats. I'm threatening queen f5 and knight e6, a basic fork idea. I'm threatening maybe a rook e1 idea, and it's just like he's running out of moves really. If he moves the knight, there's rook d8 check, and his extra piece just doesn't matter. So it didn't happen in the game, and my opponent, out of desperation, he played rook a6. Yeah, I don't really know what this move does. I suppose it just illustrates that black had no moves available in this position. So I just played the simple move rook e1, complete development, add more pieces to the attack, and after rook b6, I made diagnostics, which is the weakest spot in black's position, which holds everything together, and that is the knight on d6. So I play queen d3. Again, the point is, he cannot take on f5. If he takes on e5, there's an amazing shot, rook takes on e5, black has to accept it. Now comes queen d8 check, queen f6 here, and rook d8 wins. But even queen e5 with million threats like rook d8, knight e4, knight f6, black is just toast. For example, this sample line, rook d8, queen g7, bishop f6, everything just starts to fall apart. Now to be honest, when I'm looking at this position, it doesn't even feel that black has an extra rook, does it? So it didn't happen, my opponent played knight f7, and here I could have immediately finished off the game, so I played knight e4, kind of makes sense, rook g8, and now I missed a very nice opportunity to play knight f6 check, sacrifice the rook, play queen d8, queen f6, and rook d8 on the board. So this would have been lovely, but I simply spotted a different idea. I spotted I can sacrifice a queen. I play queen takes on d7 here, and after knight f6, my opponent had seen it enough and simply resigned. So the point here is that king e7 is just a mate on the board, so he cannot do it, but he will play something like king goes here, knight takes on d7 check. Let's say he could eliminate here, knight takes on f8, and then I at least have 2 pawns, extra 2 pawns. The black king is wide open, let's say here, h takes here, f6. Again, this is easily winning, and of course Kirpichnikov understood he's beaten and he decided to resign. So that's it. That's one of my best games, and I believe ultimately this was one of the games that ignited me the desire to play a bit more sharply, not being afraid to sacrifice the pieces or material to fight for the initiative. So I hope it helps also to you. If you liked the video, please do not forget to press like. Also write your comments. What do you think about the game? Did you like it? Have you seen this bishop takes on f7, knight g5 trick in your games? And thank you for watching. And of course, one more final note, if you're not yet a subscriber of my channel, please consider subscribing, as this will allow me to create more content. Thank you for watching. I'm signing off.